On Team Proposition, we stand for the people who the state has neglected and deprived their political power. We think ensuring economically disadvantaged people more votes are actually going to make policies sway towards them, which otherwise has not happened in the past. Three things that I'm going to chat in this speech. First, the setup. Second, why this motion gives minorities a political advantage that they have once been deprived of in the past. Third, how we have policies that help economically deprived citizens. Before arguments, the setup is twofold. First, how do we define this economic disadvantage? There are people who struggle with employment and income inequality, healthcare access, or people who are just financially unstable. Note that there are not that many policies in the status quo that help resolve these issues specifically, but rather, for example, making housing more expensive instead of more affordable, which is why house rates are very skyrocketing in the status quo, right? Second, what do these additional votes look like? Additional votes will be allocated based on criteria like income level or participation in specific welfare programs. Because, for example, individuals whose income falls below a certain threshold would probably receive certain forms of public assistance that might be eligible for extra votes. The number of additional votes could be proportional to the degree of economic disadvantage. For example, individuals below a certain income level might receive one additional vote, while those with greater economic need could receive more. First argument then on why this motion gives minorities a political advantage that they have once been deprived of in the past. First, the premise to this argument is that economically deprived citizens were always politically marginalized because of the tyranny of the majority. Historically, economically disadvantaged citizens have been underrepresented in the political process because wealthier individuals and corporations have greater access to political power through lobbying or campaign donations and influence over politicians and a lot more things. So this political imbalance means that policies often favor the wealthy and the specific needs of economically deprived citizens are ignored or inadequately addressed. For example, when economically disadvantaged people vote for issues that may seem small to the rich or uncommon, this looks like voting on an election overturned for developing drugs for terminal illnesses when you know that you won't get recurrent customers, or being unlikely to develop cures for diseases that primarily affect poor people like mesothelioma, and these issues are seen as marginal even though they're big. The implication here is that policy making is unfair. This is the second point, and it puts them at an advantage. Judge, note that politicians use excuses like benefiting the majority of people to favor the elite classes, which is reflected in the policies that they make. Since politicians come from rich and privileged backgrounds, they tend to benefit the rich. Politics should be about representing and benefiting all individuals. It's extremely unfair for opposition to say that politics is about benefiting the majority of people, because since rich people are always in favor of politics, we tell you that there should be the upper hand from the poor in voting, as we need more policies that benefit the poor because they're always seen as marginal and not important. Hence, it's reasonable for us to argue that these people deserve compensation for the opportunities that they have deprived of in the past. Then, thirdly, opposition cannot say that this policy destroys the principle of one person, one vote. Note that the ideal of one person, one vote assumes equal influence and opportunity in the political system, but wealth and privilege already distorts that equality because wealthier individuals and corporations often have disproportionate influence through donations or lobbying or access to politicians in the first place. So, in practice, this means that the economically disadvantaged already have less political influence, because by giving additional votes to economically disadvantaged individuals, we're restoring balance and ensuring that their votes are equally represented, but we also maximize the purposes of democracy in that regard. Note that in this debate, the majority isn't the most important stakeholder because the rich benefit off both from their wealth and the policies that directly benefit them. We're trying to help the people that are most neglected for hundreds of years. Second argument on how we exclusively have policies that help economically deprived citizens. This argument is divided into two folds. First, the premise to this argument is that true democracy ought to reflect the voices of all of its people, especially those who are marginalized or disadvantaged, since there's no voter turnout because of this issue. Because by giving more weight to the votes of economically disadvantaged citizens, the government will become more representative of the population's needs, which obviously leads to more inclusive policy decisions in the long run. But second, we exclusively solve this by giving additional votes to economically disadvantaged citizens, because this policy would amplify their votes, which makes it more likely that their concerns will be heard and addressed in the political system. For example, if there are more people that focus on funding homeless shelters, then they wouldn't be overcrowded anymore. Economically disadvantaged people matter, even if their trauma is not experienced by a large portion of the population. You still deserve to be heard. Very proud to propose.
Let me begin by highlighting the fundamental problem with the government's case. Their proposal assumes that the solution to economic disparity lies in distorting the democratic process. However, this approach undermines the very essence of equality. So basically, our counter model is simple and fair. It's one person, one vote. This principle ensures that every citizen, regardless of their economic status, has an equality say in shaping our society. It's bedrock of democracy, maintaining the integrity and equality of our electoral system. So moving on to my rebuttals. First of all, they say that, okay, there's going to be like better address their needs. However, first of all, Addressing poverty requires comprehensive policies focused on education, healthcare, and job opportunities. Distorting the voting system doesn't directly tackle those root issues. And B, granting extra votes may seem like empowerment, but without genuine systematic change, it risks becoming a symbolic gesture, and it doesn't guarantee that the elected representatives will prioritize or effectively address poverty. And third of all, this approach could further marginalize economically disadvantaged individuals by labeling them and potentially isolating their concerns from broader societal issues. Their second point, I'll take it later. Their second point is that, they're saying poverty deserves compensation. However, first of all, while addressing economic inequality is crucial, compensating through additional votes undermines the democratic principle of equal representation. Voting should reflect equal citizenship, not be used as a tool for compensation. You can use that in other ways. And second of all, tackling poverty requires targeted policies and programs that address systematic issues like education, healthcare, and employment, rather than altering the voting system. Now, moving on to my
POI.
Yes.
How does your side affect minorities and benefit them if their votes are always going to be overcrowded?
I'll explain that later, and my second speaker will also explain that. First, let's consider who these economic disadvantaged people are. Many working multiple jobs, struggling to make ends meet, and often dealing with systematic barriers. So do they have the time or resource to engage in more deeply politics simply because they have additional votes? The reality is this proposal does not empower them. It burdens them with a responsibility that they do not have the capacity to fulfill. What does this look like in practice? A convoluted electoral process that is difficult to manage and understand. It risks alienating those very individuals to aim to support, creating confusion and potential disenfranchisement. Now, moving on to my first point, which is equality and fairness. Firstly, let's talk about equality. Granting additional votes based on economic status creates a hierarchy within our democracy. It implies that some voices are more valuable than others, which is fundamentally unfair. Democracy should be great equalizer, not a system that amplifies division. If you want compensation, you can provide it in different ways. For example, UBI, public services, if there's already enough for those people in poverty. This approach could lead to resentment and increased social division. And people may feel that their voices are being diminished by factors beyond their control, and also undermines the concept of equal representation and setting a dangerous precedent for future manipulation of voting power. Maintaining one person, one vote preserves the equality and fairness that democracy promises and ensures that everyone has an equal opportunity to influence decisions affecting their lives. Moving on to my second point that my second speaker will further extend on, which is implementing a system where votes are allocated based on economic disadvantage introduces significant practical challenges. So here's why this approach is very problematic. Because first of all, managing a system would require constantly assessing individuals' economic statuses. This means establishing criteria for constitute economic disadvantages and ensuring that this data is accurate and up to date. And this basically would mean that the government agencies would be tasked with monitoring personal financial details, which could lead to privacy concerns and potential misuse of information. And the rest, my second speaker will talk about. Proud to oppose. Thank you.
Democracy should focus on equal outcomes, not just equal inputs. Side opposition gives 4 minutes of platitude of equal representation in democracy, not giving mechanism on how they actually solve this. So the first thing I want to deal with is a characterization. First, historically, economically disadvantaged individuals have been underrepresented in politics due to greater influence that wealthier individuals and corporations wield through lobbying, campaign contributions, and political connections. As a result, policies frequently cater to the interests of the wealthy, leaving the unique needs of economically deprived citizens neglected or insufficiently addressed. But second, what do these politicians look like? Most of the politicians are from rich and affluent backgrounds who do not really know the problems of the poor, the impoverished, underprivileged, and minorities face. Therefore, most of their policies were only directed towards the moderate, rich, and affluent. There are no policies whatsoever that are directed to help the minorities. On our side, with more minority votes, politics will now not only be dominated by the rich and the policies for the rich, now more policies to help the poor will be implemented, and there'll be more diversity and discourse in politics in the first place. Now, secondly, let's engage with the principle that this undermines the principle of one person, one vote. First, the principle of one person, one vote assumes that all individuals have an equal ability to participate in the political process, but in reality, economic disparities mean that wealthier individuals often have more political influence. Economic disadvantage limits one's ability to donate to campaigns, lobby politicians, or even access resources to vote. Therefore, providing additional votes to the economically disadvantaged aims to correct these imbalances and ensure a more meaningful equality and representation. But secondly, the current system provides formal equality. Everyone has one vote, but does not achieve substantive equality, where all groups have equal influence over political decisions. By giving additional votes to these economically disadvantaged, we're moving towards substantive equality, which is essential for a truly fair democracy. It's not about undermining democracy, but about enhancing fairness and ensuring all voices, especially the marginalized, are heard. But thirdly, different people begin from different places in terms of their economic and social power. Wealthier individuals can leverage their resources to amplify their voice, making the playing field uneven. In this sense, one person, one vote can perpetuate inequality rather than eliminate it. Giving more votes to the disadvantaged is a way to create a more level playing field, ensuring that the voices of the economically marginalized carry adequate weight. But lastly, historical precedents for weight voting. In certain cases, democracies have recognized that giving equal votes does not always result in equal outcomes. For example, some systems have given additional voting power to underrepresented minorities or areas to balance out imbalances in political representation. In this case, economic disadvantage creates a similar imbalance, justifying an adjusted voting system. This policy seeks to address existing discrimination that disproportionately affects the economically disadvantaged individuals. The wealthier already unearned these advantages: access to political networks, greater influence through campaign donations, and the ability to sway policies in their favor. Additional votes for the economically disadvantaged are a way to historically compensate and correct these imbalances. The second layer that they give is that we fail to address the root causes of economic disadvantage. Firstly, economic disadvantage is deeply connected to lack of political influence. Without meaningful political power, the economically disadvantaged cannot effectively advocate for policies that address the root causes of their hardship, such as inadequate access to education, healthcare, housing, or fair wages. By giving them additional votes, we empower these communities to push for policies that target these root causes, ensuring that the government is more responsive to their needs. The opposition, yes, argued that this policy doesn't alone solve economic equality, but it's important to recognize that on their side, right, the current system where everyone has one vote has also failed to address the root causes of economic disadvantage for decades. This problem is simply not mutually exclusive and occurs worse on their side. If anything, it perpetuates them because the economically disadvantaged have limited political power to influence policy. By empowering them to additional votes, we're breaking the cycle of neglect and pushing for a political system that prioritizes the needs of the most vulnerable. The economically disadvantaged also face barriers that go unaddressed because their votes are not loud enough in the political process. This is why having more additional votes, having political power, is a prerequisite to solve these structural problems. And this has to be solved first to actually solve these problems. So clearly, we destroy their case, and we are the side that actually brings equality, actually brings democracy. More than proud to propose. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to give on to some rebuttals about Proposition's point on how they always make about how economic disadvantages, people who has economic disadvantages are always overlooked. However, that is actually untrue in many different countries or regions. And I'd like to give some rebuttals and then move on to my own points. First of all, the first speaker on Proposition side has said that advocating for principle of equal representation, and including the second speaker on Proposition side, says that our model is actually not equal. However, voting is for everyone, which everyone has a single vote in it. It means that everyone actually has an equal chance of being able to vote for a person that they like. If you have different votes, or you have a lot of multiple votes, you can vote it to every one of the representative that you like, and it doesn't make sense because you're not actually voting for the one that you trust in the most. With multiple choices, you don't know who you're actually voting for, since you have so many gains and rights that you have in hand. Next, no matter wealth or privilege, we expect everyone to have equal rights in voting for what they believe. By providing extra votes to underprivileged, doesn't mean to them for gaining extra money or extra opportunities. This isn't supposed to be the action that we're promoting for if we do want economic disadvantaged people to become better. Instead, we should provide health, welfare, and much more easier Medicare money. Voting for policies that benefit everyone could never help because everyone could take it into advantage.
Why?
Yes.
Doesn't your side also have a hierarchy embedded in democracy for centuries?
Explain that later.
No, first of all, I would like to explain that later since it will also be in one of my arguments. And I'd like to continue on. For voting for policies that benefit everyone will never help. Everyone could take it into advantage, excluding the rich. The rich will always be rich, and the economic disadvantage might always stay that way if the policy always benefits everyone and gives everyone the same amount of money and different opportunities to currency. And even so, we could not guarantee that the policy would still be in charge, even if many economic disadvantaged people can cast a vote for it. Next, the second speaker on proposition side only says that policy is only focused towards the rich. This is fundamentally incorrect. If the people chose this, and especially if majority of the population is people who are actually average, and the rich are always actually is another form of a minority. Not everyone is rich, and only majority is actually being average. So actually, if the people chose this, it means that it benefits everyone. For the policy to go through, it must be voted by the majority and not only by the minority rich people. Prop has only been focusing on how economic disadvantage is being overlooked. However, no, they have UBI, they have government health, they have people health service, public education. We shouldn't need more compensation. Everyone works hard, including the rich, to build their wealth. There are legal labor laws protecting the rights of ethnic minority or people who are living economically disadvantaged.
POI.
Huh? No. And now I'd like to move on to some of my own arguments. First of all, implementing a system where votes are allocated based upon economic disadvantage introduces a significant practical challenges. First of all, managing such a system will require constantly assessing individuals' economic statuses. This means establishing criteria for what constitutes economic disadvantages and ensuring that this data is accurate and up to date. The bureaucracy involved will be immense, require substantial time, money, and resources. Government agencies will be tasked with monitoring personal financial details, which could lead to privacy concerns and potential misuse of information. A system based on economic status is vulnerable to manipulation. These uninformed voters are easily influenced by TV advertising. People use social media to sway and promote misinformation, especially if it's a very short reel or video, since that's the only time that many economic disadvantaged people could spare to watch while they're always working. They wouldn't bother, isn't that they wouldn't have enough time to actually thoroughly do deep research about which politician could actually benefit the country. But the advertising is something that these voters could actually see, which is why our side actually advocates for the equal representation of everyone in this society. Thank you. I'm proud to oppose.
A democracy is most legitimate when it reflects the will of the entire population, not just the wealthy elite, right? When economically disadvantaged individuals receive more votes, their voices are amplified to ensure the policies are shaped for all citizens, not just those with the resources to influence government, right? First clash on justification. This clash will cover upon the true role of politics and the meaning of rightful democracy. Opposition tells us that they will support the one vote principle. They emphasize equality. Layers of analysis here, Judge. Firstly, we tell you that one vote principle cannot be applied here when the rich is literally favored by the politicians. We see no reason why we have to give people equality or same voting voice when there's a clear inequality and favoritism towards the rich, right? Secondly, even if we assume that it is true, we win because we don't get why they prioritize the one vote principle. Opposition is being extremely radical here, right? Thirdly, weighing on headcount, we say that the role of politics and democracy is to benefit all people, not the majority or the privileged. What's the point of favoring the rich when they already have the upper social status? We need more help towards the poor, right? Secondly, opposition tells us that more votes doesn't lead to the politicians helping the poor. Responses here. Firstly, we tell you that it's not mutually exclusive at all, right? It's not right for opposition to criticize our policy when they literally do nothing to help the poor, right? If they support the status quo, we tell you that this was our last resort. Even in the status quo, the poor is not hurt. Oh, I like to accept that a bit later. Secondly, weighing on headcount, right? Again, we win the right headcount because on their model, only the majority, the privileged that are already favored are benefited. On our model, the poor is also hurt. Yes?
Aren't poor people already benefited in the status quo by these public systems and these welfare?
Okay, so like Judge, if that was the case, why do you think we're creating this extreme policy? We say that since the status quo isn't listening to the poor enough, and since the politicians are only favoring the rich, that is why we created this policy. They never respond to this, right? Despite existing compensated
measures, significant economic disparities persist, right? Poverty rates, income inequality, and wealth gaps remain substantial. Existing programs often do not address the root causes of economic disadvantage or offer enough support to lift individuals out of poverty, right? Okay, thirdly, the last layer that they have to respond to their principle. Okay, so second clash on the main stakeholder, right? The underprivileged and the promotion of a better political environment, right? Opposition tells us that our policy creates a hierarchy of democracy, right? First, this is a deadlock at best, right? Their side already has a hierarchy of democracy because majorities are always benefited the most, right? I think in this case, our side is better because we give minorities a chance for their votes to actually matter, right? Note that their side doesn't promote the principle of democracy because not everyone's opinion matters in their model, right? Majorities were always put at a disadvantage. So it's fair to compensate minorities for all of the things they have been through for centuries, right? Secondly, the opposition may argue that this policy alone doesn't solve economic inequality, but it's important to recognize that no single policy can fully address complex systematic issues, right? This measure is part of a broader strategy to empower the disadvantaged and make their needs a central focus of the political process. By giving them greater representation, we enable a shift in the policy landscape, which will lead to reforms that target the structural cause of poverty, such as education reform, housing, healthcare access, and social safety nets, right? Their solution already failed to address inequality and bring democracy, right? So opposition says that the rich are usually minorities and minorities are already compensated enough, right? Judge, firstly, and even if the rich are minorities because politicians are rich, they focus on the rich, right? Secondly, the opposition conflates economic disadvantage with minority status, right? Economic disadvantage is about financial hardship, while minority status refers to group identity based on race, race or other factors, right? We say, Judge, we win at the end of the day because not only do we provide why we win on head count, but we prove to you why the middle class workers and the poor are benefited more than persistent on-site proposition.
So, Judge, the government policy looks pretty and helpful on the outside, but actually it's just marginalizing the community who is already not represented in the society enough, the average class citizens. I'll be proving this why in my classes. Okay, so one of the major clashes, the clash that proposition has been telling us the whole time, marginalization, right? Proposition is talking about how these people who are poor, these people who are economically disadvantaged are not represented enough in the society right now. They don't have many policies helping them and they're underrepresented. So they have less political influence. Instead, their policy will help this bad because they get more votes to vote for the politician who will help them most. But in opposition, we believe that this is not the case. Addressing poverty, there's already enough resources put in it, and it's not going to help that much. Not helping just simply politicians benefiting them with laws, it's not going to change the whole wealth gap between the ones with low socioeconomic status and the ones with high economic status. So it's not solving the point of marginalization completely. And let's see why their case is actually unrealistic. One, so they say that right now these less economically disadvantaged people are not helped at all. They say that they have no policies benefiting them. But as our second speaker already previously said, in the status quo right now, there's welfare programs for people who actually are in poverty and cannot survive. Money. Yeah?
How do we violate democracy's purpose if we compensate the minorities who have always been ignored in politics?
I'm trying to say that right now. They aren't the minorities who are ignored in politics. And they're already compensated, which is what I'm saying right now. They have welfare programs, they have public schools, they have public hospitals. These are all free for their use. And this is already helping them. And they have welfare. They can get money from government that's helping them to solve the problem in poverty. So they're already compensated. And they're not the marginalized community Prop is trying to say right now. They're already helped by the government a lot with a lot of these policies. The actual community who's actually being ignored is the majority of the whole country. These average middle class working citizens, right? People just assume that they don't need any help because they're not rich and they're not poor. So they're not poor, so they don't need any help. So everybody is either helping the rich or helping the poor. Which is why welfare programs, no thank you. Welfare programs and these public hospitals, public systems, public schools are already helping these ones right now. But the ones marginalized actually citizens are these middle class citizens because there's already systems helping them, but nothing is helping these average middle class citizens, right? Can you see any policy that's giving them better giving them better work hours, giving them better pay? There's nothing helping them which is why right now, this is why we need to advocate for like the majority and the actually marginalized citizens, which is not the minorities that proposition has been proposing to be in the whole debate. So we need to provide more opportunities for them, and they're not helped in this motion either, and they're even more further marginalized because they're middle class citizens, so they're not economically deprived, so they don't get the extra votes. So the politicians voted, yes, they will be helping these minorities more, these people who have low socioeconomic status more. But the thing is, they're still not helped, so they're just marginalizing these citizens who already are marginalized even more. So their model is not helping everyone. Okay, and second of all, as we said, the people, if politicians, if they actually cared about these people with low economic status, they'd already be helping them and already be advocating for them in our position right now. Because if they care, they'd advocate for it. But in this case, when they're only advocating for them because they have more votes, isn't that kind of like being like using these minorities and like taking advantage of their votes instead of actually being here to help them? There's a change in mindset. If they're advocating for them even when they don't have additional votes, I actually care for them. But if they're advocating for them when they only have additional votes, it's called I'm advocating for them because they have more votes. It's taking use of them and actually not benefiting these minorities. And they keep on saying that policies are benefiting the rich and privileged, but they're actually another form of minority. They're a low amount, so they're not, because they're not majority of the vote, which is why the policies that's created is actually not helping them as much. And proposition has just been ignoring every single point our first speaker said and just trying to rebuild our points, which we previously rebutted a billion times, which is why we win this class and we should win this debate. Thank you.
So all government is focusing on is those who are economically disadvantaged when they completely ignore the status quo of how poor people are already getting compensated so much. They have public services, they have public healthcare, they have public education, and they have UBI. And those people who truly need to get cared for are those middle class people. They need to pay tax. They cannot receive public health services, and like they don't get to receive what people in poverty do. So the government also completely ignores what LO has mentioned in their speech, which first of all, these people in poverty don't have enough knowledge to vote properly because they don't have time. They don't have the time nor the effort in order to actually care about these kind of things when they're struggling to make ends meet, when they're doing these labor jobs, when they're actually trying to work hard. And second of all, it also takes a lot of unnecessary manpower to keep track of economic statuses and making this voting fair. And this could be used for better things like improving the public services for healthcare and education. Now let's ignore all those flaws in government's case and then just talk about their best case scenario. Let's they argue that by giving additional votes to economically disadvantaged people, we empower them to influence policies that directly benefit them. This could lead to more social programs, better healthcare, and improved education specifically targeted at elevating poverty. However, it is important to recognize that poor people already have access to various beneficial services. Many countries already have welfare systems, public education, and healthcare designed to support these communities. Thus, adding more votes may not significantly change their situation, but rather create a disproportionate influence in the democratic process. Now, moving on to our worst case scenario. Even if we don't get additional votes to economically disadvantaged, we can still focus on benefiting the middle class, those who are often overlooked in social policies. The middle class is crucial for a stable economy. They pay taxes, support local business, and contribute significantly to society. By ensuring their needs are met, we foster economic stability and growth, which indirectly benefits everyone. And Prop is marginalizing them, while Prop is marginalizing them even more. And this basically, so proud to oppose. Thank you.
The LO and DLO literally says that the poor shouldn't vote and saying that they can't make decisions. Minorities do not actually get enough compensation. UBI doesn't even exist, and that's not related to their political power. The principle of democracy assumes that everyone's voice matters, but there's already a hierarchy that's embedded in democracy in the status quo. The diseases that economically disadvantaged people go through are never funded. House price rates are skyrocketing already. So don't let opposition conflate the truth about compensation because it's simply not enough. First issue was unnecessary, but is the status quo's compensation to minorities enough? I think existing programs like welfare or social security and unemployment benefits doesn't fully address the needs of economically disadvantaged individuals. Because why? Many people still struggle to meet basic needs despite all these programs happening. So we tell you that real-world examples and data already shows how current support systems fall short in effectively addressing economic hardship. It's simply not enough. So why would we have this motion in the first place if minorities' needs were already addressed fully? It's just not enough. Tyranny of the majority still exists. But also, current compensatory measures primarily focus on providing providing financial relief or access to services rather than addressing the issue of political representation specifically. Because I think economic disadvantage affects political influence and decision-making power, which existing programs do not actually address in the status quo. I think Aiden and Onew did a really good job explaining this already. Now, their whip comes up with a new point about how they benefit the rich, but the middle class should be like favored. I think the middle class is a part of the spectrum. If you're in low middle class and you're going to receive more votes compared to the rich class, I already said this in my setup. Second issue, which side better helps politics? What does their side essentially looks like, even in their best case? I think many politicians come from wealthy and privileged backgrounds, and they do not fully understand the issues faced by the poor and impoverished and underprivileged and minorities. So as a result, their policies are often cater primarily to the moderate and affluent classes, which leaves needs minorities unaddressed and unsupported. But what does our side look like even in our worst case? On our side, with more minority votes, policies or politics will not only be dominated by the rich and the policies for the rich. Now, more policies to help the poor will be implemented, and there will be more diversity in discourse and politics in the first place. But for these reasons, SIG wins. Thank you.